Amara Blake's voice wasn't loud, nor was it angry, but the calmness in each word was like a slow blade cutting through the air, taut like a violin string. The entire first-class cabin fell into silence. Every eye turned toward the teenage girl in a light gray hoodie who had just been removed from her first-class seat, simply because she didn't look like someone who should be sitting there. Not everyone would dare to ask the question that Amara asked. Not everyone would have the courage to reclaim the seat they deserved through calmness, not power. This is not a story about privilege. This is a story about dignity, about a young girl who was humiliated in front of a crowd and how she made the entire system reconsider itself. This emotional and inspiring story not only made millions reflect, but also led to real change in an entire industry. Watch until the end to find out what this girl did and what lesson her powerful father taught the world about fairness and self-respect. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread these human stories to more people. Now, let's begin the story of Amara Blake, the brave girl in the sky. Amara Blake appeared no different from any other ordinary young woman, calm and polite, holding a first-class ticket, a gift from her father meant to be a gateway to an exceptional experience. But instead, it marked the beginning of an unexpected series of humiliations. With her gentle demeanor and modest appearance, Amara didn't stand out among the other passengers. But the moment Helen Sutter, the head flight attendant with platinum blonde hair and a cold, detached air, saw Amara, everything changed. Helen's gaze was sharp, and her judgment even sharper. In her eyes, Amara didn't belong in first class. She was a misplaced guest. Every word from Helen carried an undertone of discrimination, a quiet contempt suggesting that Amara's calm, graceful demeanor, along with her different appearance, was why she didn't belong in this space. Amara sat by the window, wearing a light gray hoodie and simple jeans clothes chosen for comfort, not to show off. In her hands, she tightly clutched her boarding pass as though it were a badge of honor for her outstanding academic achievements. This was her first flight alone without her family, a milestone she had eagerly awaited to mark her own efforts. Instead of joy, what awaited Amara was the disdainful stare of a flight attendant who believed she didn't deserve to be there. From the first interaction, the atmosphere became tense. Helen's steps were slow and stiff as she approached Amara's seat, her eyes filled with doubt and irritation. "Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat?" Helen's voice was sweet but laced with sarcasm. Amara was momentarily confused, but tried to remain calm, replying that seat 1A was assigned to her by her father. But Helen didn't hesitate, immediately responding, "Let me see your ticket." Her tone was devoid of any sympathy. Amara obediently handed over her boarding pass, but Helen quickly glanced between the ticket and the young girl with a scrutinizing look. For a moment, it felt like the entire cabin fell silent. Other passengers merely watched in awkward silence, none of them stepping forward to defend her. The entire cabin felt frozen. Silent judgments pierced Amara from all sides, making her feel completely isolated. Helen, who saw herself as the enforcer of the airline's strict standards, declared loudly, "This seat is for paying first-class passengers only." Her voice was cold, leaving no room for debate. Amara's heart raced as humiliation washed over her. Not only had she lost her seat, but she was also subjected to a subtle discriminatory insult, as if her appearance or background alone made her unworthy of respect. One by one, every gaze shifted away, and no one extended a hand to support her. It was as if every glance agreed with the injustice that had just occurred. As Amara quietly gathered her belongings and began to leave her seat in a sorrowful state, a man sitting nearby observed everything in silence. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his calm demeanor concealing a simmering rage. The man was no ordinary passenger. He was Graham Blake, Amara's father and the owner of the airline. His face betrayed no emotion as he read the message from his daughter, a chilling whisper confirming that his daughter had been unjustly ejected from her seat. Each word in the message felt like salt in his wounds, for he knew this wasn't a mistake, but an act driven by prejudice and arrogance. Graham's response was discreet but resolute. His jaw clenched and his eyes darkened as he read the message carefully. This wasn't just a matter of a girl being kicked out of her seat. It was a sign of a broken system that consistently overlooked those deemed different. He felt heartbroken to see his daughter, whom he saw as a symbol of effort and hope, become the victim of an indifferent system. He had always believed in fairness, and the silence of the witnesses only fueled his determination. While Amara walked toward the back of the cabin, the shame and injustice burning in her heart, she quietly texted her father. "She made me leave first class and took my ticket from me." The short message was like a bitter confession. A fleeting moment where youth was stolen by a merciless system that saw her as an intruder. From afar, amidst the indifferent and cold stares, Graham continued to watch with a piercing gaze. He adjusted his cufflink, pulled out his phone, and called the operations center. His voice was calm and steady but filled with authority. That call set off a chain reaction throughout the flight, signaling that the truth had been harmed and justice was about to be restored. The man who had just witnessed his daughter's humiliation, Graham Blake, was not alone. His presence and power were not to be underestimated, and within moments everyone would understand that this blatant insult would never go unpunished. Tension in the cabin grew. As the captain of the flight, a man with over 20 years of experience in the skies, was informed about the situation. On the internal display screen, the image of a senior operations officer appeared. His voice was calm, but firm, as he recounted the events in chilling detail. Captain Howard Bricks squinted as he listened to the report. A first-class passenger had been forced to leave her seat and move to economy class. And that passenger was none other than Graham Blake's daughter, a name that in the airline industry was both respected and feared. The message was clear. If Graham was on this flight, the matter would not pass quietly. Realizing the severity of the situation, Captain Bricks immediately followed the directive without hesitation. From the flight attendants to the passengers, everyone understood that this was no longer about a mistaken seat assignment. It was a direct confrontation with a pressing issue: systemic discrimination. As the verification process to call Helen Sutter back began, the atmosphere on the plane shifted dramatically. The cold indifference of those who had silently witnessed the event began to crack under the weight of guilt and the fear of impending retribution. Graham Blake, who had been a symbol of calm authority until now, began to emanate a dangerous energy, a silent anger, but one potent enough to shake the skies. The air seemed to crackle with tension, a justice not born from administrative procedure, but from a decisive, uncompromising action. A message of righteous revenge so clear that no one dared to doubt its consequences. While the passengers were still in shock, Graham moved like a commander directing his troops. He instructed his team back at the operations center, his trusted assistants, to activate the entire system. From customer service to operational management, everyone was mobilized to ensure that Helen Sutter, the flight attendant, who had made the wrong move would face consequences in a transparent and unforgettable manner. Graham's message was clear. No matter how small the cruel act, if it was aimed at his daughter, it would certainly face repercussions. A young woman, though despised and humiliated, was still a symbol of hope, resilience, and a future of greater justice. The incident, carrying the heat of both personal tragedy and social injustice, resonated in the hearts of everyone on the plane. The silence that had once enveloped the cabin was now shattered by hushed whispers of anxiety and unease. The stark contrast between the indifference of the majority and the determination of one man reflected the greatest pain of modern society, a society where prejudice, whether covert or overt, can still strip away the opportunities of those who deserve them. As the plane soared through the clouds toward its destination, the storm Graham Blake had ignited was about to shake the system to its core, a system that had long failed to protect the vulnerable. Meanwhile, Amara Blake sat huddled in economy class, surrounded by loneliness and humiliation. But it was she who had become the catalyst for the fight against deeply rooted prejudice. Her quiet dignity, though trampled, had not shattered, and it was about to become a symbol of rightful resistance. Her father's suppressed rage, combined with the silence of those who had ignored her plight, was about to create a massive chain reaction, forcing everyone from passengers, crew members, to distant authorities to witness an uprising. A moment where despair could have consumed Amara entirely, but would instead become the foundation for a monumental and righteous act of retribution. In the minutes to come, Amara Blake's story would no longer be a forgotten incident. It would become a saga of courage, controlled anger, and the triumph of justice. A story that could make any woman, whether 65 or older, believe that even in the darkest of times there is a light powerful enough to ignite hope. In the first-class cabin, the aroma of coffee filled the air. Helen Sutter, with a self-satisfied expression, stirred sugar into her coffee, without a thought to the consequences of her actions. In her mind, forcing Amara to leave her first-class seat was just part of the job. For Helen, maintaining order was paramount, and anything that was out of standard was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Helen Sutter failed to grasp the weight of the cruelty in her actions, and she never anticipated the ripples of emotion she had caused in everyone on the flight. Even the other flight attendants, who normally followed her commands without question, now exchanged anxious glances, quickly looking away whenever she passed by. The dry, crackling sound of the intercom cut through the quiet space like a bell tolling Helen Sutter. "Please report to the cockpit immediately." The sound was sharp, like a spoon tapping against a porcelain cup. Exactly at the moment Helen was sipping her coffee as if nothing were amiss. In that instant, she froze in place. Unsure if she had misheard, she stood still for a few seconds. Her colleagues quickly pretended to be busy, as though they wanted to deny what had just occurred. With no time to reflect on the consequences, Helen set her coffee cup down, adjusted the crease in her perfectly tailored uniform, and made her way toward the cockpit with heavy steps. Each of her steps down the glossy aisle seemed to stretch on forever. With every step, it was a reminder that the storm was approaching. Little did she know from seat 1B. Graham Blake, dressed in a dark blue suit, sitting motionless like a statue, was watching her every move. His face was expressionless, but his gaze was cold enough to freeze colder than any clouds Helen had ever flown through. As she entered the cockpit, Captain Howard Bricks, a seasoned pilot, pointed to the seat next to him. On the other side sat Anthony Wexler, a representative from headquarters, his eyes sharp as a blade. He didn't beat around the bush. We've received a report that a first-class passenger was asked to leave her seat, without just cause, he stated bluntly, without a trace of emotion. Her name is Amara Blake. The atmosphere in the cockpit thickened. Helen forced a smile and began to explain that there was a young passenger in seat 2A who seemed to have been in the wrong seat, and she had simply adjusted the mistake. But when asked to verify by checking the boarding pass again, she hesitated and admitted that she had only glanced at it and hadn't recognized the name. Her confessions fell into the room, like cold raindrops on a winter window, soft yet chilling. Wexler leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Did you make that decision based solely on how the passenger looked?" The question cut through all her excuses like a knife. A slight nod, a shaky exhale, and everyone understood this was no longer a seating error. This was a prejudiced act full of bias, and it could not be accepted. Amara Blake is not an ordinary passenger. He emphasized she is the daughter of Graham Blake, the owner of this airline, and you humiliated her in front of the entire cabin. Helen's face turned pale. She tried to argue that she was just doing her job, that it was an honest mistake, not intentional. But all her arguments were dismissed by Captain Bricks in a calm yet stern voice. "You will return to first class. You will apologize in front of all the passengers and personally escort Amara back to her seat. After the plane lands, you will appear before the disciplinary board to take responsibility. No form of discrimination is permitted, not even the slightest." The judgment struck Helen like a blow, yet she had no choice but to stand firm. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed the door open to leave the cockpit. She returned to the passenger cabin, her face no longer calm. The passengers, who had previously exchanged only polite smiles, now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Her colleagues, who had once been friendly, avoided her gaze, pretending to be busy as though they didn't know her. In seat 1B, Graham remained seated, his eyes filled with power as if he could see right through everything. Without a word from him, that look alone was enough to make Helen understand he hadn't forgotten, and he didn't forgive easily. Meanwhile, Amara sat quietly in economy class, slipping her headphones in as an excuse not to listen to the whispers around her. But those whispers still seeped into her mind, hushed voices, pitying glances, and an isolation that rose like an undercurrent within her. Her posture was straight, yet her body was stiff with the lingering pain. At that moment, Helen, now stripped of her usual confidence, silently approached Amara's row. Her voice was softer than usual, tinged with nervousness. "Ms. Blake, it seems there's been a misunderstanding." She bent slightly, as if to shorten the distance that had been used to assert her dominance. Amara pulled one earbud out, looking up at Helen. She said nothing, only looked. That silence was like a pressure cooker, making Helen rush to continue. "It was really just a small mistake in the seating arrangement. Apologize for the inconvenience," but Amara didn't blink. Her gaze, though calm, held a power that made the entire cabin seem to hold its breath. It was a silent strength, a pain so deep that she refused to let herself cry. Amara Blake's voice, though soft, was filled with firm resolve, cutting through the silence between the rows of seats like a cold blade. "You saw my ticket and still asked me to leave my seat. Why did you think I didn't deserve to sit in first class?" Her question, though not shouted, resonated like a warning bell. The composure in Amara's words mixed with the pain of being insulted, and her steadfast self-respect froze everyone around her. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Each passenger gradually grasped the implications of her question, that this incident was not just a simple mistake. A silent wave of indignation spread throughout the cabin. Those who had previously kept their heads down or pretended to sleep now exchanged looks. There were whispers of confusion. Eyes now focused on Helen Sutter, who stood frozen, stripped of all her authority. The thin veil of administrative error had been torn away. Now it was clear to everyone this was prejudice, discrimination, wrapped in the guise of rules. All of Helen's previous attempts to justify herself evaporated as her face turned from pale to hollow. After a few seconds of suffocating silence, Helen spoke, her voice hoarse. "I made a hasty judgment. I didn't check the ticket properly. I'm sorry." A trembling confession, but it could not undo the pain that Amara had endured. Amara neither nodded nor turned away. She quietly took out her phone and sent a brief text to her father. "Dad, I need to know how serious this situation really is." The response from Graham Blake came almost immediately. A short, direct reply showing the demeanor of a man who had once run an empire. "It's not a mistake. It's an insult. It's a betrayal of the values this airline claims to uphold. She must be held accountable." Amara's eyes brightened, not with anger, but with the feeling of being trusted. She was not alone. She had not been abandoned. Amara turned to face Helen once more, her voice still remarkably calm. "I'll return to my seat, but only after you explain why you thought I didn't deserve it." Her words thickened the air in the cabin. It seemed as though everyone was holding their breath. No one spoke, no one turned away. All were waiting for a true confession. This was no longer just an issue between a passenger and a flight attendant. It had become a test of courage, honesty, and morality for everyone present. The looks from everyone around were no longer those of detached indifference. They shared in the discontent, empathized with Amara, and began to feel ashamed of their previous silence. Helen Sutter, who had once used rules to assert her power, now stood before the unflinching face of the girl she had once scorned. Every word Amara spoke was like a blow against the wall of prejudice she had relied on. "No one in first class has been asked to show their ticket. Except for me," Amara continued, "and you saw my ticket, but still told me to stand. Your actions were not just a mistake." Helen's face gradually contorted under pressure. Her hand visibly trembled. She opened her mouth, but it took several seconds before the words came out. You're right. I looked at you and I judged wrongly. I thought you didn't belong there because you didn't look like the usual passengers." Her words, though she tried to avoid them, were enough to expose the truth. It was discrimination. It was prejudice. It was an affront to her dignity. In seat 1B, Graham Blake remained silent, but his gaze was like an unspoken sentence waiting for the right moment. Amara nodded slightly, as if she had completed a small part of her fight. She stood, straightened her jacket, and said, "Lead the way. I'll return to my seat, but not because you asked, because I deserve it." The whispers in the cabin had now turned into collective sighs of agreement, admiring glances. A few older passengers nodded gently. A younger woman whispered to her friend, "She's so brave." And so high in the sky in a cabin that was once thought to be indifferent and bound by rules, a young woman dared to stand up for justice. Not with a shout, but with a powerful, haunting silence. Amara Blake's words were gentle, but unshakably firm. She didn't shout, didn't accuse. She simply asked, "You saw my ticket. Then why did you still think I didn't deserve to be in first class?" Her words rang out like a warning bell amidst the suffocating silence of the cabin. The passengers around her, who had been pretending to be indifferent, began to feel the weight of her question. The question wasn't just for Helen Sutter, it was for an entire system that had silently watched Amara took out her phone. Her hands remaining calm and sent a text. It wasn't simply a request, it was an ultimatum delivered through silence. "Helen, why did you say I didn't belong in first class even after seeing my ticket?" The atmosphere in the cabin grew dense as if it was about to explode. Even the air conditioning couldn't dissipate the heaviness that filled the space. Helen, standing nearby, looked down at the floor, her face torn between regret and panic. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket. Only me." Amara continued, her voice not loud but clear with each word. The sound echoed down the aisle like the beating of a drum, forcing everyone to listen. At this moment, passengers who had previously buried themselves in headphones or books began to look at each other. They exchanged glances that no longer avoided the truth. Some nodded slightly. A few younger passengers furrowed their brows. A wave of awakening began to spread just a few minutes later. Amara's phone vibrated lightly. A message from Graham Blake. "Keep going, don't rush. Let her understand the full gravity of what she's done. No one escapes the consequences of degrading another." She set her phone down, raised her head, and looked at Helen with eyes full of determination and a silent sorrow. "I'll return to my seat. But before that, I need you to tell me, why did you think I didn't deserve it?" Silence. A pause that seemed to last for hours. The sound of the plane's engines hummed quietly, but now that noise only served as a backdrop for the psychological pressure building up. Passengers around her shifted slightly, some leaning back in their seats, others leaning forward as though watching a trial in the sky. Helen stood frozen. Her face dropped no longer, holding any of the arrogance that had once covered her. Her voice was shaky and fragmented. You're right. I didn't ask anyone else. I just thought you didn't belong here because you didn't look like the usual passengers, a confession insufficient to cleanse the mistake, but enough to expose the truth. It wasn't a mistake. It was prejudice. From the back of the cabin, a young flight attendant, Emma West, watched quietly. She had always been one to follow procedures, avoid trouble, and maintain the airline's best image. But this time, her gaze carried something else, a quiet awakening. After a few seconds, Emma gently walked over to Helen, whispering just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "You should sit down. You're about to faint." Helen turned sharply, her voice tense. "I don't need your comments." Emma shrugged, offering no response but whispered back, "I'm just telling the truth. You're sweating like someone sitting in the defendant's seat." That brief exchange, though small, vividly illustrated the contrast between passive cruelty and courageous empathy. Helen, who had once represented power and rules, now became a living example of the cost of a wrong judgment. She replayed the details in her mind the moment Amara was asked to leave her seat. The unmasked confusion in the girl's eyes and the protest stopped cold by a cold stare. She saw it again, like a slow-motion film. But this time she was the one forced to watch and could not skip past it. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the cold metal counter. The employee badge on her chest now felt as heavy as a stone. The golden letters, no longer a symbol of pride, but a testament to her mistake. Every glance from the passing passengers, no one spoke, but everyone knew. An older man spoke up quietly. His voice hesitant. I I saw what happened earlier. It really shouldn't have been like that." Amara turned to him, her voice soft but cold. "A mistake. No, that was a choice. She saw my ticket, knew who I was, and still chose to treat me as unworthy." No one responded. There was no need. Amara's next words. "If I weren't the daughter of someone important, would this have been handled differently? Cut like a sharp knife into the heart of every person in the cabin." In the service area behind, Helen clutched the cold metal counter. Every attempt to wipe her sweat with a tissue made her realize she couldn't erase the consequences. Everything she had once believed in, that she was the representative of principles, that she was doing the right thing, now lay in ruins. An intercom bell rang out cold and urgent. Without anyone saying a word, she knew that the call was for her and that there would be no way back from this. Helen Sutter's hands trembled uncontrollably as she picked up the wall-mounted phone behind the service area. Her voice was stiff as though she were clinging to a professional image that had long since shattered. "This is Helen." On the other end of the line, a deep, calm voice responded. Clear, decisive, unmistakable. "This is Graham Blake." Just those 4 simple words. But for Helen, time seemed to stop. The space around her became dense, as if it were on the verge of collapsing. In that moment, there was no need for shouting, just the sound of that voice, and she knew that the situation had spiraled beyond control. "You will explain every action you took on this flight, every decision, every word, every expression." Graham's voice rang out like a verdict from the highest court. Each word fell like a hammer into Helen's consciousness. Every sentence was a reminder that this was no longer a personal matter, but a betrayal of the humanity and service principles that the airline had once sworn to uphold. She swallowed hard, her throat taut with bitterness. She could only respond in a whisper, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, sir." But that response didn't ease the situation. It only confirmed that it was too late to regret. The atmosphere in the cabin now felt charged with the energy of an impending storm. No one spoke, but everyone felt that punishment was coming and it would not be gentle. Amara Blake sat back in first class, her eyes gazing out the window at the gray clouds drifting silently. Her face remained calm, but inside there was a whirlwind of memories, the veiled insults wrapped in false politeness, Helen's cold stare, and the silent complicity of those around her. Her fingers gently gripped the old novel, a book she had read dozens of times now, serving as her last mental shield between her and the injustice she faced. A text notification lit up on her phone. It was from her father, Graham. "She will never be allowed to speak to you again unless truly necessary." "I've made that clear." Amara's smile was faint but heavy with meaning. It wasn't one of victory, but of quiet peace after the storm. She slipped her phone into her pocket, her gaze unwavering as though silently declaring, "I won't let this pain define me." Across from her, an older man, his neatly combed silver hair and polished leather shoes leaned slightly toward her. "Miss, I just want to say what happened earlier was truly unfair. You handled it with great composure." Amara looked at him, a faint smile brushing her lips. She replied without a hint of bitterness, "I know. If I had shouted, people would have called me rude. If I stay silent, they'll praise me for being composed." Her words cut through the air like an arrow embedding deeply into the present. The passengers around them heard, and they understood. They understood that this girl was not just someone who had been wronged. She was a representation of everyone who had been judged simply for their appearance. In the service area, Helen leaned against the counter. Her face had turned pale, her palms damp with sweat. Every step her colleagues took as they passed by felt like a small blade silently cutting into the pride she had once believed to be invulnerable. She tried to reorganize the water trays, wipe down the teapot, but every action seemed pointless. The whispers, the sideways glances from the crew had now become an indictment. Without words, Emma West turned back silently, placing a tissue on the counter beside Helen. "He is Mr. Blake, isn't he?" she asked softly, her eyes never leaving Helen. Helen merely nodded like a prisoner being called in a courtroom. "He doesn't need to shout," Emma added his presence. "Here is enough." The flight continued to glide through the blue sky, but inside a silent earthquake was taking place. A wrong action, an unfounded refusal had triggered a necessary cleansing. And there, in the very first-class seat that had been denied a young woman, Amara Blake was teaching society a lesson in dignity. That dignity doesn't come from the seat you occupy, but from how you face injustice without lowering your head. In the back service area, Helen Sutter sat motionless, her entire world seeming to collapse. The power she once held, the confidence that had once cloaked every step she took, was now reduced to a fragile shell as breakable as glass under the fluorescent lights. The whispered conversations of her colleagues, the disappointed looks from the passengers, all felt like arrows piercing her heart. With each passing second, she felt it more clearly, the decision made in an instant, based on a shallow prejudice about a young girl, had destroyed the career she had spent years building. She clutched the crumpled tissue in her hand, trying to wipe away the cold sweat that covered her palms. But the sweat only soaked through, more a testament to the panic she could no longer conceal. Even the cold metal counter could not soothe the storm raging in her mind. In the cockpit, Captain Hastings and the co-pilot maintained regular communication with the ground control. But what they were transmitting was no longer the usual updates. It was a message about an impending investigation, a warning about an unavoidable confrontation. "Someone will have to take responsibility for this." The co-pilot muttered, his voice gravelly, as if it carried the weight of the entire aircraft. "And I don't think she understands how bad this is going to get." When the seatbelt sign blinked on Captain Hastings' calm professional voice rang out, instructing everyone to prepare for landing. But in the back of the cabin, Helen still stood frozen, as if caught between the desire to escape and the fear waiting at the door. The plane descended. In the cabin, some passengers quietly closed their laptops. Others began packing their belongings, but most of them were looking ahead, waiting for something. And then he walked in, a tall security officer with broad shoulders and a stern gaze. Without speaking loudly, his mere presence caused the atmosphere of the entire cabin to stretch taut with tension. Every small conversation quieted, every whisper ceased when the officer scanned the cabin and called out firmly, "Helen Sutter." The curtain separating the service area opened. Everything seemed like a prearranged ritual. Helen stepped out her steps, heavy, dragging the weight of her mistakes behind her. In first class, Amara Blake didn't take her eyes off the image. She didn't say a word. But her silence, strong and resolute, was like a quiet flag of defiance. She didn't need to stand up, didn't need to accuse her resilient existence in the seat she rightfully belonged to, was the clearest affirmation dignity cannot be taken away just by a prejudiced glance. Her father, Graham Blake, nodded slightly from the seat beside her. A nod without words, but heavier than 1,000 speeches. The final moments before the plane touched down felt like a dramatic scene set up for a grand stage. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination." The captain's voice rang out warm but full of meaning. "Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign turns off." No one spoke. No one moved. It felt as though they weren't listening to a standard flight instruction, but the opening of an ending. The end of the injustices that had been allowed to persist for far too long. Under the harsh white lights, Helen Sutter, once the embodiment of rules and power, was now just a broken, shattered image, escorted out of the cabin as a warning to anyone who thought they could overlook fairness with confidence and uniforms. Meanwhile, Amara sat quietly, her gaze still fixed ahead, but no one could mistake the light in her eyes. That was the light of someone who had weathered the storm and still stood firm. She had endured the discrimination. She had felt the chill of public humiliation. But she hadn't fallen. On the contrary, she became a symbol of resilience in the face of the storm. And all those present that day, especially the older passengers, the ones who had remained silent for fear of inconvenience, understood that silence was no longer an option. The plane rolled to the gate, and the security officer never took his eyes off Helen. She walked her head lowered as if knowing she could never come back. Meanwhile, Amara Blake, who had once been removed from her seat for not fitting in, was now the one the entire cabin silently respected. As Amara Blake gathered her belongings preparing to leave the plane, each step she took felt like a silent declaration that her dignity, the academic achievements she had worked hard for, and her right to be in any space just like anyone else would forever be the guiding light for those who had been made to feel less than they were. She sat back in her first-class seat, her expression calm but full of presence. Though the memories of what had happened still lingered like shadows in her heart, she refused to let them define her. Meanwhile, at the back of the cabin, Helen Sutter, once proud in her neatly pressed uniform, was now facing the cold, unyielding truth of justice. Just a few minutes earlier, while all the passengers were quietly waiting, a security officer had boarded the plane with an authoritative demeanor. His voice clear and firm, like an order that couldn't be refused. Helen Sutter. The atmosphere froze. Every eye turned toward the service area as the curtain parted, revealing Helen. Her face pale, her legs trembling, her eyes filled with panic, but with no place to hide. "You will come with us," the officer declared. Whispers spread across the cabin like a wave. Some passengers were surprised, while others silently nodded, as if the scales of justice had finally tipped in the right direction. "Is there a problem?" Helen tried to maintain her composure, but her voice no longer held the certainty. It once did. There's a report of discriminatory behavior when a passenger was removed from first class. Graham Blake has requested an official investigation. The officer responded, each word like a needle pricking her. Without resistance, Helen nodded and began walking as if she were waking from a nightmare, her steps heavy, her gaze avoiding everything. This was the same walkway Amara had once been forced to walk down. But this time, everything had been reversed. Helen's footsteps echoed through the cabin like the gavel of a judge. Each step, each sound was a tolling bell for a system that had long been lenient with prejudice. As Helen approached Amara's row, she didn't dare look directly at her, but Amara's gaze remained calm. No anger, no contempt. It was this calmness, more than any reprimand, that made Helen feel the weight of the mistake she had made. The entire cabin became a silent courtroom. There was no judge, no jury, but every passenger with their looks and their silence became an irrefutable witness. Some looked at Helen with reproach, Others simply turned their faces away. But no one called her a representative of order anymore. Each step took her closer to the plane's exit. Each step was part of the hell she had created for herself. When the plane came to a stop, the cool air from the airport poured in, but instead of providing relief, it only deepened Helen's sense of isolation. Stepping off the plane, she saw two men waiting. One was Elias Brown, the chief operating officer, known for his sharp gaze and unyielding principles. Next to him was a stranger. No introduction necessary. The silence and the lack of emotion in his gaze were enough for Helen to understand this was the person who would determine her fate. "Follow us," Elias said. No words of comfort. No sympathetic glances. They led her down a narrow hallway at the back of the airport, an area where passengers were never allowed to tread. The pale gray walls, the harsh fluorescent lighting, and the echoing sound of their footsteps created a setting colder than a Chicago winter. At the end of the hallway was a small room inside which was a long table, 3 chairs, and a closed door. Elias stood next to the door while the other man, wearing a name tag that read Lucas Harrington, head of compliance, sat across from Helen, a thick leather-bound file in front of him. No words were needed. His gaze alone spoke volumes. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice soft as a breeze yet carrying the weight that made her heart race. Helen nodded slightly, her lips dry, barely able to whisper, "Yes." On the table were irrefutable pieces of evidence, the captain's report statements from 4 independent passengers and an official complaint from Graham Blake himself. Helen was no longer the flight attendant in charge, no longer in control. She was now just a guilty employee standing before the disciplinary tribunal of the very organization she had once represented. Lucas Harrington gently tapped 2 fingers on the leather file in front of him before beginning. "In this file, everything has been clearly documented. You treated a first-class passenger as if she didn't belong there without thoroughly checking the ticket, without asking politely. You made an assumption based on her appearance and behavior, and then publicly acted on that wrong decision in front of everyone." Each word hit Helen Sutter like a blow to her chest, stripping away the armor she once believed was power. Lucas looked up, staring directly at her. "In first class, did anyone else ask to show their ticket?" Helen hesitated, then almost whispered, "Just her." Lucas sighed, his gaze darkening. "Do you understand what this has done to the airline's reputation? This is no longer a small mistake in seating. You humiliated the CEO's daughter right in front of him, less than 3 meters away. This is not just a personal failure. It's a severe risk to the company's reputation." In that moment, tears welled up in the corners of Helen's eyes, but she bit her lip to hold them back, not out of courage, but out of the shame she couldn't put into words. "I made a mistake," she stammered, but even she could hear how hollow her voice sounded. "No," Helen Lucas said, his voice, quiet but resolute. "You made a choice. A wrong, dangerous, and public choice. You represent the company, and you've created a media crisis that's spreading fast on social platforms. A passenger filmed the incident and posted it before the plane even landed. It felt as though the whole room was collapsing on Helen. We are suspending you immediately with no pay." Lucas declared, his voice firm without room for argument. "You will receive notice about your disciplinary hearing within 72 hours. During this time, you're not permitted to access any company facilities or contact current employees." He then closed the file with a soft click, but the sound echoed like the closing of a door on the career Helen had once been proud of. Helen's legs felt numb as she left the meeting room. The fluorescent lights in the hallway blazed brightly but coldly, casting shadows over every step she took, like stage lights in a tragedy with no escape. On the other side of the airport, in the quiet and luxurious VIP lounge, Amara Blake sat with her father, Graham Blake. The room was bathed in soft yellow light, with plush leather chairs and a faint scent of wood, a world completely opposite from the chaos they had just endured. Amara sat upright, holding a cup of hot tea, her gaze distant. She wasn't trembling, wasn't broken, only calm, sharp as a blade forged by the very injustice she had suffered. Graham leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but full of concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Amara replied, her voice soft but sure. "Did anyone bother you after you returned to your seat?" "No. I think they're afraid." She responded in a cold tone, then smiled faintly, a smile that was both weary and proud. Graham nodded, relieved. "We've suspended her, at least for now. If she doesn't admit her mistake and understand the consequences of her actions, she won't have another chance. People like her never admit their wrongs," Amara replied, her gaze unwavering, a statement that was both sad and firm a few hours later when the sun had set behind the glass rooftops of the airport. Helen sat alone in a small apartment, her flight attendant uniform still on, now just a fabric that itched and constricted like a false skin. The apartment was silent. The only sound was the faint hum from the hallway light, like the world silently turning its back on her. The company-issued tablet sat motionless on the desk. Its screen black deactivated the moment the suspension order took effect. A cold notification from the executive team was already opened on her computer screen, its title brief, "Suspension Notice." A soft vibration from her phone startled Helen, but instead of a message of concern, it was just the heavy silence of unanswered texts. Her colleagues, once close, those who had praised her for handling crises, now avoided her, as if she carried an infectious disease. In her mind, the images of Amara's cold stare, Graham's sharp voice, Emma's sympathetic silence, and the passenger's silent judgment played over and over. For over 10 years, she had believed she was doing the right thing, following the handbook, adhering to regulations with no emotions. But now, all those rules had become a mask for the prejudice she hadn't recognized. She hadn't just lost her job, she had lost the image of herself, an image she had falsely believed in for all those years. In the moment when the truth became undeniable, when the suspension had been declared, Helen Sutter had nothing left but to face the emptiness in her own justifications. She couldn't turn back time, she couldn't erase Amara Blake's gaze, nor could she wash away the hurt she had caused a girl simply because of unconscious prejudice. The heavy guilt, the public shame, and the irreversible consequences for the airline's reputation were now burdens that Helen had to bear alone. The world outside continued to turn still, bustling with its indifferent rhythm, but the echoes of that mistake continued to reverberate in the small apartment where Helen had once proudly donned her uniform with confidence. Now it was just a piece of fabric hanging loosely on a hook, symbolizing the power that had fallen away. In first class, Amara still sat quietly, her face bore a calm, almost icy demeanor. But deep in her eyes was an ocean that had been stirred. The events on Flight 477 were like a bad dream, and every action of Helen, once seen as a role model, had left an indelible scar. The plane slowly descended. Inside the cabin, everyone could clearly feel the aftermath of that discriminatory act resounding loudly and clearly. The disciplinary process had been set in motion by none other than Graham Blake, the CEO of the airline, and Amara's father. His internal call had once been as cold as a breath of winter, but the weight of it was enough to shake the entire crew. "I don't need to hear excuses," Graham said through the line, his voice calm, yet as sharp as a razor. "The issue isn't me, it's my daughter. You made her feel unworthy. You treated her like a problem, and you did it in front of the whole cabin, where everyone chose to remain silent." After the call, Helen's hands trembled as she set the phone down. Each step she took down the aisle between the seats now felt like the sound of a gavel delivering a verdict. The probing gazes, the harsh white lights, and the Emma's Helen Sutter. "Please follow me," from the security officer. All of it wrapped together like a sentence that could not be appealed. With each step, Helen felt the truth crashing down on her like hail in the summer heat. Each step was an accusation. Each gaze was a silent tribunal. When she passed Amara's row, the young woman simply looked up at her. No smile, no contempt, just a cold, deep stare, as if she were seeing straight through to Helen's soul. After the plane came to a stop, Helen was led through a cold internal hallway where Lucas Harrington, the compliance supervisor, and Daniel Rowe, the chief operating officer, were waiting. No one greeted her. No one opened the door with a smile. Only steely gazes and an atmosphere heavy as stone. They led her into a small meeting room with 3 chairs, a long table, and a file already placed in front of her. Lucas began, "We've gathered all the data, the captain's report statements from 4 passengers, and most importantly, the official complaint from Mr. Graham Blake." His voice wasn't angry, but it was cold and sharp as a blade. "This document confirms that you decided to remove a first-class passenger from her seat based solely on how she looked. You didn't check the ticket. You didn't verify her identity. You just looked and judged." Helen nodded faintly when he asked, "Was anyone else in first class asked to show their ticket?" She whispered, "Just her." Lucas shook his head. "You humiliated the CEO's daughter while he was sitting just a few feet away. Do you understand that this is not just a personal mistake, but a reputational crisis for the company?" Tears welled up. But Helen didn't cry. Only the pain inside her grew like acid eating away at her. "Was wrong," she said. "No. Helen, you made a choice, and it was the wrong choice. From this moment on, you are suspended without pay. You will receive notice of a disciplinary hearing within 72 hours. During this time, you're not allowed to use the internal systems or contact any employees." The sound of the file closing echoed like the final lock on the door to her career. Helen stood up slowly, leaving the room, like someone stripped of her honor. That evening, in the small apartment, Helen sat on the edge of the bed she hadn't even bothered to tidy. Her flight attendant uniform hung loosely like a ghost of the past. The company tablet lay deactivated on the desk. No encouraging texts, only cold emails, the subject line bolded, "Suspension Notice." A soft vibration from her phone startled Helen, but instead of someone checking in, it was only the heavy silence of unanswered messages. Her colleagues, once close those who had praised her for handling crises, now avoided her as though she carried an infectious disease. In her mind, the images of Amara's cold stare, Graham's sharp voice, Emma's sympathetic silence, and the passenger's silent judgment played over and over. For over 10 years, she had believed she was doing the right thing, following the handbook, adhering to regulations with no emotions. But now, all those rules had become a mask for the prejudice she hadn't recognized. She hadn't just lost her job, she had lost the image of herself, an image she had falsely believed in for all those years. an email titled Responsibility. In the silent apartment, Helen Sutter stared at her phone screen. She hesitated before opening it, the fear and regret creeping through her like two opposing currents in the same flood. Sutter, I believe by now you understand the severity of what happened on Flight 477. I will not repeat what the committee has concluded. Only this responsibility is not punishment, but an opportunity to recognize your mistakes. I am giving you that opportunity. If you sincerely apologize to my daughter, I will pass it on to her. But understand, this apology is not for me. It's not for the airline. It is for Amara. There were no threats, no harsh language, just an opportunity, a door that only courage could open. Helen set the phone down, as if it weighed more than anything she had ever held. She was no longer anyone in the eyes of the world outside. Not the leader of the crew, not the model in her neatly pressed uniform. She was now a symbol of the exposed mistake, a living example of the consequences of prejudice. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of cold water, but nothing could soothe the bitterness that still burned within her, the bitterness of a belated realization. Returning to her bedroom, she opened her computer, created a new email with the subject, Responsibility Response. Dear Mr. Blake, I do not expect forgiveness. I am not writing this letter to justify myself. I am writing because I now understand the wrong I have done. I misjudged Amara. I acted based on prejudice, not truth. I let the bias in my heart speak louder than reason, and for that I am ashamed. If Amara agrees to accept it, I offer her my sincerest apology. I understand that she has the right to refuse. After reading it over several times, Helen hit send. In that moment, she no longer wore the badge or the uniform, but within her something flickered, something akin to redemption marking the beginning of a true journey to make amends. Across the airport in the executive lounge, Amara Blake sat opposite her father, Graham Blake. The room was serene, the warm lighting, the soft leather chairs and polished wood furnishings, an entirely different world from the chaos they had just endured on the plane. Outside the window, the city glistened with lights, and the pulse of life continued at its rapid pace. But here, in this quiet moment, another storm had just passed. "Are you okay?" Graham asked gently. Amara nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I'm fine. No one bothered you after you returned to your seat?" "No. I think they're afraid." Her voice was neither bitter nor harsh, just the calmness of someone who had walked through a storm without being broken. Graham confirmed that Helen had been suspended and that the committee was reviewing the situation closely. "We're changing the process," he said. "Not just because of this, but because of people like you, people who've been wrongly judged without a chance to speak for themselves." Amara smiled faintly, a smile that was both proud and determined. "I don't need her to apologize directly," she said. "Forgiveness isn't for her, it's for me. I don't want to shake hands with someone and pretend everything is fine, because it's not." Her words weren't just those of someone who had been hurt. They were the voice of an entire generation, those who had been judged solely on their appearance, background, or silence. In that room, as Amara typed out her response to the apology letter, a wave of change began to form. New policies had been drafted. Training on unconscious bias, transparent internal feedback channels, and clearer passenger evaluation procedures in business class were all beginning to be implemented. "We will fix this entire system," Graham said, his eyes full of resolve. Not just for you, but for others who have been silenced like you. As for Helen, the next morning she woke up in the empty apartment where her uniform was no longer a source of pride, but a reminder of a mistake. All the light of hope now lay not in her hands, but in the hands of the daughter she had once dismissed. And there, in the airport lounge, Amara Blake was not only sitting in the seat she deserved in first class. She had regained something far more important, her dignity. Amara Blake sat in silence. The silence was thick like a heavy woolen blanket in the cold November night. She was no longer on the plane, no longer sitting in first class, but her mind had yet to land. Everything that had transpired on Flight 477, from the public insult, the smoldering anger, to the serious actions taken by the executive committee, now echoed in her like the reverberation of a fateful moment. Elsewhere, in a quiet and still apartment, Helen Sutter had just finished reading Amara's response email. Sutter, I've read your apology letter. I appreciate that you didn't attempt to justify yourself, because most people only realize their wrongs when they themselves are harmed. I don't need you to apologize directly. Not because I am angry, but because I think you now know what that feeling is like. This isn't just between you and me. It's the story of those who've been judged before they had a chance to speak. I'm lucky because my father was there, but many others were not. And for that reason, I accept your apology. Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn to change. Helen sat still. Those words didn't reject her, nor did they forgive her easily. They were a mirror she couldn't avoid reflecting the exposed mistake and the lesson she had to face. In the living room, Helen leaned back in her chair, her hands covering her face. The shame no longer came only from the suspension from the scrutiny of her colleagues or from the email titled Responsibility. It came from the realization she hadn't been fair. She had let the rules become a mask for the bias within her. Meanwhile, in the executive lounge at the airport where soft light filtered through the large glass windows, Amara sat across from her father, Graham Blake. She was silent, her face calm, her eyes steady but full of inner strength. "Are you okay?" Graham asked. "I'm fine," Amara replied, her lips slightly pressed. "No one bothered you again." "Perhaps they're afraid." Graham chuckled softly, not out of triumph but from the relief of seeing his daughter maintain her dignity amid the storm. Claire, no longer the Helen Sutter that people once knew, had sent Amara a handwritten letter. In it, she wrote, "I once thought that staying silent and following procedure was the best way to keep things calm. But now I understand silence can also become a dangerous tool when it's in the hands of someone with power. I don't expect forgiveness, only that from my mistake others won't have to feel what you once did." Amara read the letter, feeling both cold and warm. It wasn't a perfect atonement, but it was the first step toward awakening. In the days that followed, Blake Airways, under Graham's direct leadership, began implementing unconscious bias. Training opened anonymous feedback channels and overhauled their entire first-class customer service procedures. These were no longer just token training sessions. They were real dialogues, genuine exchanges helping each person reflect on the bias they might not have even recognized in themselves. Amara, with her calm demeanor, never demanded anyone be fired, but from her gaze, her words, and the weight of her silence, the entire system understood that change was no longer a choice, but a responsibility. On the armchair, in the corner of the airport lounge, Amara held her father's hand. The sky outside was still blue, the planes were still taking off. But from now on, every flight with Blake Airways would never be the same, because there was a girl who had been forced out of her rightful place. And then, with the strength of her dignity, she returned not through power, but through character. As the plane landed, all the passengers gradually exited the cabin. But one thing remained on that flight, a lesson about fairness, self-respect, and awakening. Amara Blake, the girl who was pushed out of her rightful seat, not because of any mistake but because of prejudice, did not shout, nor did she resist violently. Instead, she chose silence, a silence that made the entire cabin listen. And something strange happened. An entire system, one that existed based on standards hierarchy and biased judgments, had to stop. It had to look directly at the truth. It had to change. Helen Sutter, who once held power in the cabin, was now no longer in her prestigious uniform, but sitting silently in an empty apartment facing her own mistake. The apology letter she sent did not turn back time, but it was the first step toward atonement. And Amara, when reading that letter, chose to forgive. Not because Helen deserved it, but because Amara believed that only forgiveness could bring true change. This is not just the story of one flight. It is the story of millions out there, those who were once doubted, looked down upon, just because they didn't fit the mold. Amara's story is a powerful reminder that never judge others based on appearances. And if you see someone treated unfairly, stand up, or at least don't stay silent, because silence can also be complicity. We hope that after watching this video, you will see others with empathy before making judgments. Believe that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. And if you have privilege, use it to protect, not to discriminate. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. If you feel moved, if you think the lesson in this story deserves to be shared, then please like this video to show your support. Share it with friends and family, because who knows, it might touch someone's heart who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future stories that touch the heart.